Okay, so let's get started. Really excited to be here and to see so many of you here interested in this topic. I know there's lots of really practical hands-on sessions right now. This one's a little bit more thinking about the future, thinking about the role of Drupal. So I hope it generates some good food for thought, some good ideas, and also kind of challenges us to think about how we do things, both in the Drupal community and on our own projects. So I'm going to be talking about how content management kind of fits into the future of Drupal and what we should be looking out for. So for those of you who I haven't met, my name is Suzanne. I'm the co-founder of Evolving Web. We're an agency specializing in Drupal, and I'm our Drupal practice lead. I love teaching Drupal. It's one of the things I've kind of specialized in over the years, and I also lead the Promote Drupal initiative. So if you have any ideas about how to market Drupal better, or you want to get involved, I would love to hear from you. Just a quick background on who Evolving Web is. We work with a lot of organizations that make a big impact in the world, and that includes a lot of government organizations, both in Canada and the US. And we recently had the pleasure of launching the new website for Senator John Ossoff. So you can check that out as one of our new portfolio items. So I wanted to broach this topic of how Drupal fits into our current digital landscape. And on preparing for this presentation, I was kind of thinking of what we call Drupal. I have a presentation I do for people who are brand new to the Drupal community called What is Drupal? Just trying to define what the community is, what the software is. And when we talk about Drupal, we often use these different nouns. And when I first started using Drupal 13 years ago, we were calling Drupal a CMS, a content management system. And that really made a lot of sense because what can you do with Drupal? You can go in, you can define your different types of content, and you're basically saying, okay, Drupal does, you don't have to make websites just by editing HTML. Now you have an interface for that. And so we call this content management. Easy enough. I think everyone's familiar with that word, that phrase. But pretty early on in my Drupal career, I started using a different noun. I started using the word platform. And I did that because I was trying to differentiate Drupal from other systems that would also allow you to edit content. And I was trying to describe the fact that Drupal is more than just editing content. You can also use Drupal to integrate with other systems, other platforms. It's a lot more interoperable. You can add a lot more features. And since technical decision makers were usually the ones making the choice between Drupal and something else, I found that using this word platform kind of expressed that flexibility. And that was really appealing to that audience. And now over the last few years, we hear people talking about this kind of new buzzword, well, it's been around a little while now, digital experience platform. And the platform part kind of implies that we're building more than, that we have more flexibility. The experience part implies that it's more than just websites. We're actually talking about other channels as well. We're talking about an ecosystem where you have all these different marketing platforms, you want to do content personalization. And so usually when we're talking about digital experience platforms, we're trying to get marketers excited. And we're referring to this whole suite of tools that you can use. And I was trying to think when I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking, oh, it'd be great if we had a diagram to show the difference between CMS and platform and digital experience platform. And the truth is that things haven't changed all that much that you might need to draw a new diagram. So when we had, when we were talking about Drupal as a platform, we were always talking about how we could use Drupal's APIs and feed content into Drupal, and all of that is still true and still makes it true that Drupal is a really good platform for marketers. But Drupal doesn't come out of the box with all those tools integrated. It's an open platform. You can integrate it with lots of different tools. And so it's a little bit hard to draw this diagram because it might look different for everybody's different install of Drupal. And then I was thinking about the projects that I tend to work on, which are not always for big enterprises. Often these are projects for big institutions, and the emphasis is really more on the content and getting content into the hands of the right users. And so I thought about maybe another term that I could propose using, which is a content strategy platform, which I think speaks maybe more to Drupal's strengths in managing content, but also the fact that it is so much more flexible than just a run-of-the-mill CMS. So today I just wanted to dig into this conversation a little bit more and think about how we can prioritize content strategy more when we're dreaming big and thinking about what Drupal can be as a platform. So there's lots of reasons to prioritize content strategy. And I would say that for institutional websites, content strategy is maybe the #1 thing we should be focusing on. And this is how we should be prioritizing all the features that we're building. And basically, this is how we should be thinking about websites these days. So there's a few reasons for this. So content, organizations that are investing in digital right now, they're really trying to organize content around user needs. So every time I'm working with an organization and they're trying to improve the design, improve the architecture of their site, maybe add a new feature, maybe taking hundreds of websites and standardizing them. Often, #1 at the top of the list of pain points is that users can't find content. And that's often because content is kind of misorganized. It's organized around maybe how the organization is structured and not so much around user needs. So one reason to prioritize content strategy is just so that we can start thinking about user needs first. These days, when we're facing lots of change, especially in terms of government, maybe institutional goals, messaging needs to be really easy to adapt. And so it's important that we have a platform for not just launching a website with a certain audience and certain types of content, but something that we can adapt if we need to. So if we need to launch a new campaign, or we need to add a new type of content or start publishing content in a different way, we need our platform to be able to adapt to those needs like right away. We also need to be able to integrate the web content with other digital services. So it's easy to say, oh, our platform, we can integrate it with other systems. Like you can have a sign-up form for your newsletter, or you can embed a bunch of forms. Like that's one type of integration. But for those of you who know Drupal well, you know that the content in Drupal is kind of the focal point for everything. So we can build a lot of functionality actually around that content. So if you have some services that you're offering, you can have content about those services, and then that can integrate right into actually users being able to interact. So you can have transactions through your website that's integrated right into the content. Often for websites that have content as a real focal point, content needs to be portable. So it's great that content is living in your website, but you also need to get it out into other channels, maybe share content between many websites. And then content compliance is a requirement for most sites these days. So we really want to be able to prioritize not just getting content out to people who can see it through the browser, but really making sure that our content is accessible and follows our brand standard and everything like that. So these tend to be the drivers of change in a lot of web projects that I'm seeing. And so these are also reasons to prioritize content strategy. So what should we be aiming for? If we're talking about creating a content strategy platform. What does that even mean? What does that look like? So I've made many presentations over the years about how we should prioritize the needs of content editors. And I've been trying to figure out a way to express this that kind of goes beyond just the content editor audience. And I think on a lot of projects that I work on, what we're actually trying to do is get the people who know the content really well closer to the end users who are consuming that content. So I know I work with a lot of organizations where everybody on the team, they kind of know the messaging, they know what has to get out there, they understand the needs of users, but they're not necessarily the ones who have control over the website. They're the ones, you know, working on communication strategy, or they're the ones answering the phone when users call or citizens call, or whoever the end users are. And getting them and getting their expertise kind of closer to the end users is kind of what we're trying to do here. And so if we actually created this platform, what would it look like? I think it would look like, well, yes, content editors having a better interface that's user-friendly, that's designed for them, and being able to create accessible content without a ton of training. Being able to be aware of what content's going to look like if it is pushed out to these other platforms. And then I think it also means that the people doing communications, the teams of communicators, actually being able to make independent decisions about content strategy when they need to, kind of when it's called for. So if you have, you know, if some new policy change happens and we have to get a new, we have to get new information into the hands of our end users, how easy is it for us to spin up that new communications plan through our platform? Well, I think it should be easy. So that's kind of what I think that the platform should look like. And then organizations that can actually pull this off, that can actually, you know, communicate through their website without getting developers involved in making every single change. I think they tend to give teams ownership and actually allow communicators to own their content and own their publishing workflow. I think that they also do a really good job of sharing best practices. So an organization might have, you know, a dozen websites or 100 websites, or just a large website with many pages, but there might be many branches and sub-organizations kind of interacting with those, sort of running those different areas of the website. And the better that an organization can do of sharing best practices, I think that they'll be much more successful. At the same time, I think it's important to have the ability to experiment and prototype and try to make improvements. So there's all kinds of opportunities all the time to make content more accessible, to add things like, you know, schema.org metadata to your content. And if things are too locked down, it's going to be hard to add those new features, hard to experiment. And I think organizations that prioritize content strategy are also asking users what they think. Sometimes this can be really scary to actually say, okay, we just spent $200,000 making these improvements to our website. Now let's go ask the end users if they think it was worth it, what they think, like let's ask them for their feedback. But if you have a platform that allows you to adapt your content strategy, then you're more incentivized to go and ask users for feedback, because you'll be able to act on that feedback. So this is like all very nice ideas. These are all very nice ideas, but I think we want to know how Drupal is actually going to help us get there. And the good thing is, the exciting thing is that Drupal has always been really content focused because of its roots as a flexible content management system. You know, all the features that we take for granted in Drupal, like taxonomy, content types, views. These are really all things built around the node as the core building block, and now, content entities as core building blocks of just how Drupal works. So Drupal is really well suited to be a content strategy platform. It has so much going for it. And I think there's two main reasons. First, it's really flexible. We all kind of hear that as like a #1 benefit of Drupal. And in particular, the content editing UI and the workflow for creating content is one of those flexible things. So we know that, you can give permissions to different types of users. You can set up different content moderation states and transitions and give permissions to that to different types of users. So you can really adapt how content is published. And you can give control directly to content experts without giving them the keys to the kingdom and ability to change absolutely everything. So that's a huge strength, and that gets us a lot of the way there. At the same time, Drupal is really great for standardization. So if you're trying to build a platform that tons of people are going to use, but you need everything to fall into your brand, to be accessible, to be compliant, however you're defining compliant, then using Drupal is great because everything you build can be reused. So every module, piece of functionality you create, every element of the look and feel, your design system, all the configuration that you create in terms of different content components, content types, taxonomy, all of that can be, it's configuration, and now we can reuse that from site to site very easily. So Drupal's great for standardization in many ways. But there are huge challenges left, so let's talk about those, because that's kind of the interesting part. So this is sort of the gap analysis of why Drupal is so flexible and we can standardize it, and so why doesn't everybody have these amazing content strategy platforms where you can just roll out a new type of content or adapt your content strategy without rebuilding your site? So why is this such a challenge? And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is this idea of Drupal being flexible. Back when I started using Drupal, if you wanted to, you'd go onto your website, you would go and check some checkboxes and change how Drupal worked, because everything's configurable, right? And site builders can just go and change things without writing code, which is fantastic. But now with configuration management, we actually manage all of the changes to configuration. So anything that's not content, you kind of need to know what you're doing if you're changing configuration. You need to do it in a development environment and then export the configuration, then import it into the production environment. And that's actually a great thing because it means we have more control, and our website's not going to go down because somebody checks a checkbox. So this is all for the best. But at the same time, it means that we lose a lot of flexibility, because to actually make those changes and check those checkboxes, we have to be developers, and we have to work with a developer or somebody in a developer type role who is comfortable exporting and importing configuration. And so this means that it takes extra steps to make change. This is a challenge. Another challenge is that customizing the editing UI, customizing the moderation workflow, this takes a lot of time. And it takes thoughtfulness, and sometimes projects just don't make time for that. It's also easy with flexibility to add a ton of configuration for things like moderation states and content types, paragraph types, block types. It's easy to add a ton of modules, and so these are challenges, because then you end up with so much configuration that it can be hard for other people to know what to do with it all. And then with page building tools becoming more and more popular, so if you're going to use the layout builder, you're using paragraphs with layouts, you can end up with a lot of variety and less consistent content. There's also lots of challenges around the standardization piece. So yes, standardization, if you have a module, you can install it on every Drupal site. But it's actually possible for two Drupal sites to have a lot of the same code, a lot of the same themes and modules, but then have really different content structure. So I'll give you an example. In the for the Canadian government, Canadian federal government, there's a distribution of Drupal that a lot of people are using. And so those websites are all going to share, maybe they're all going to share the same theme. They're based on the same distribution, so they share a lot of the same modules. But then when you install that, you still need to customize the content structure, all the content types to meet the needs of your department or your agency. So people end up with really different content structures, and then you end up with something really not standardized because those sites can't share content. I see it also a lot in the municipal context, where there might be one large municipal website, but a lot of little microsites and maybe a library site. And even if there's some sharing of themes or whatnot, even if they're using the same modules, they might end up with different ideas about how to do page building. So maybe one of those sites will use panels, and one of them will use paragraphs, and one will just do everything with blocks. And then it's hard for those sites to be hard to standardize the documentation or best practices, or kind of figure out, how to standardize them retroactively. Content personalization, I think, is something that's become more and more popular, along with the idea that we need digital experience platforms and we should be doing more marketing through our websites. And content personalization is something I think we see a bit less in government, but just as an example, these screenshots here are from this website, bonjourquebec.com. It's a tourism website. And so a lot of the content is personalized based on your location. If you're in Canada, if you're in the US, if you're in France, you're going to see slight variations of the content. And this just means that you end up with a ton of content to manage. And it can be hard because it's almost duplicate content that you're creating. And then finally, always kind of something that comes to haunt us. A lot of websites have legacy content, which, sounds like something, okay, maybe you have a website that was originally built in the 90s and you have all this HTML that you're dealing with. But legacy content could be something much more recent. A lot of websites have content that was originally created with a WYSIWYG editor, and there were lots of WYSIWYG tools, and maybe somebody created tons of layouts through the WYSIWYG, and a lot of variation of the type of content that we have. Handcrafted HTML can take a lot of work to convert into something more following a content type structure, content that's more easy to port, share, and use. And so changing how content editors are authoring content, and also interactively that HTML to yielded structured content, this is a lot of work, especially if it's something that has to be done manually, because there's a lot of variation. So these are all kinds of challenges websites face, and that make it really hard to focus on content strategy, because there's just so much complexity going on, and things that we have to contend with. So how can we actually go about converting a website into something that looks more like a platform? I think the very first step is to ask the content experts, to get them involved in the process. And content experts could be the content editors, it could be the subject matter experts. And so people who know the users and who are actually writing content for them. And you can get these involved by inviting them to user experience workshops, gathering requirements, asking them what they think, creating a persona for these users, and really prioritizing their needs like you would the needs of end users. You can also build documentation for your platform that's more driven by the needs of content. So not just explaining, here's how to author a page, but more, here's why you would create this type of content. Here's why you would use these components or these paragraphs or these blocks to build a page. And using real examples so that the documentation isn't just about the functionality, but more about the why of the content. You can also prioritize content governance a bit more. And often in planning a project, I'll do a workshop on content governance where we figure out who needs to approve content or who owns different types of content, different branches, who's involved. So we map all of that out. But Drupal's a really great platform for building that actually into Drupal. So all of the tools we have around roles and permissions and workflows, but also things like views that can be customized for different types of users and just help them make sure they're reviewing and updating their content. Simple things like this can lead to a more effective content workflow. And then investing in cleaning up legacy content, so this I'd say is a hard one. But one thing that could make it easier if you're doing a migration or you're making other changes to your website, sometimes content cleanup is something you can do in bulk. So if you see there's a whole bunch of content and all of it is using the same old WYSIWYG, HTML kind of craft, maybe there's something you can do in bulk to clean that up. And if you don't do this as part of a migration, I think it's a missed opportunity. But if you already migrated and you still have legacy content, maybe this is something you can look at doing retroactively. And then iterating on smaller projects. So every time you have like a smaller project, like, oh, we really have to create a one-off site for this thing, or we have to create a landing page that's a bit more customized. It's easy to just do it thinking about the project itself. But if you think of every small project as an opportunity to iterate, to improve on your platform, it's going to maybe be easier to make change, to show how, oh, well, we did it this way and we made this page or this section or this new site much more accessible, or we made it easier to edit. And then you can show how that could be used for your entire platform. And then next steps for Drupal, because I think there's lots we can do on our individual projects, but there's also a lot we can do to improve Drupal as a whole and just make it a more easy to use to build out a platform. I think there's two areas. The first one, I see a lot of movement on optimizing the content editor experience. This topic comes up again and again in the Dries note, where we hear about the roadmap for Drupal and all the improvements that are underway. There's the new Claro theme in core, and also the gym theme, which is kind of a place where a lot of experimentation and new ideas are being developed, which is really exciting. Then the other idea is about drawing the line between content and configuration. And this is more about, okay, it's great that we have really flexible tools for content authors and editors, but what about the configuration side? Like, might be nice if we could spin up sites that site builders can make changes to, configuration changes, without editing code. And how do you manage these types of configuration without doing away with content, with configuration management, which is so valuable for the deployment process? So I think this is another area where, maybe there's some work to be done in Drupal. I know updates, automatic updates is one area that kind of falls into this category, but maybe there are other things too that we want to make available through the UI that are more in the realm of configuration. So those are all the ideas that I had. I would love to hear comments and feedback and maybe throwing out questions or examples. I also just wanted to let you know about some Drupal training that my team has coming up. Next week, we're doing a Drupal theming course. We have also SEO and accessibility trainings around Drupal coming up in November and December. So feel free to take a look at that. So I'm just going to take a look at the chat. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the Q&A. Oh, I see that the screen share has dropped. Yeah, I'm going to share my, I'll make sure that I can share my slides. Maybe I'll just do that now as we are chatting. Yeah, Hopin. I've seen this happen recently on Hopin at DrupalCon Europe, where technology kind of fails a bit halfway through. So hopefully you were able to follow along with the ideas anyway. So anyone have any questions or comments? Oh, great. Okay, I have somebody asking a question about elaborating on the best practices for accessibility. Can we make accessibility a must-have out of the box? So this is a really great question because accessibility is a must-have, and out of the box in Drupal. I mean, we do say that Drupal is accessible out of the box. But the thing is, as soon as we start customizing Drupal, that means we're changing the content model. We're adapting it to our needs. We're often changing the look and feel, and we're often adding functionality. And every single change we make is an opportunity for accessibility to slip between the cracks. So it means that we can introduce things that are not accessible. And anytime we're adding flexibility, like we're inviting content editors to go and make decisions about the structure of a page, that also introduces a place where, potentially they're going to add content in an order that doesn't actually make sense or doesn't follow a consistent flow, maybe doesn't use headings correctly. So pretty much the more flexible that we get in terms of a platform, the more features we add, the more opportunities there are for these things to slip in. Which just means if, the closer you stick to the core, the more accessible maybe it'll be, but it won't be adapted to your needs. So you really do have to build in a step where you are testing accessibility every time you introduce a feature, every time you do a release. And then for how this works for content strategy, content editors, and kind of what tools you're giving, ideally, if content is really structured, then content editors don't have to think so much about the accessibility. They're fitting their content into the structure, and then it's the templates in Drupal or whatever kind of front-end tool you're using that's determining the accessibility. That being said, there's always education to do on the content side around kind of link text and image selection, and anytime you're giving access to a WYSIWYG editor, of course. So that kind of training is also essential. And yeah, that Joseph's mentioning editorially, that's really useful. I mean, Site Improve is kind of more of it's a paid tool, but it's more going to give you an overview of content compliance for your entire site. So that's helpful, especially if you're doing an audit or a revamp. I'm blanking on the name. There's a few other tools we use. I mean, definitely Axe is a great tool to do automated testing. Any tips on convincing clients of the value of improving site editor experience? Yeah, definitely. It's something that gets often pushed to the end of a project. I would say that giving visibility earlier on in the project to the content editor experience is going to help. So this can mean things like actually demoing that experience and saying, this is how we could make it better, or here are the different options. It's going to kind of show how a better experience is actually going to change your content. And then I would also say trying to get those users at the table and having even a survey. If you can't invite them to like a workshop, having some kind of forum for them to give input is going to be valuable. Every time we run training and we hear from these content editors, often at that point an organization will wake up and say, oh yeah, this is really important. Let's also add these features for these users. Another question, you mentioned the need to create different versions of content for personalization. Are there different ways to do personalization that you have seen successfully in government? I think that it's often a matter of reducing what is personalized. So rather than, I think I've seen mostly cases where personalization projects have gone less well because there's just a desire to come in and say, oh, we need to personalize every single block on the website. And then that just leads to so much content duplication. But if you can say, well, we only need to personalize these landing pages or these types of blocks, if you can do it in a more streamlined way like that, that's going to help. And the other thing I think is going to help is the iteration piece. So don't start your project and say, oh, let's personalize everything, and then you actually build out different iterations of content. Start with, well, let's create a different user journey for each of these types of users, each of these target audiences. And then once you have some data on how that's the success of that, then maybe you can say, oh, well, here's a user journey that seems to be working well, but we can further optimize. It's really important to us. Now we know more about how our users are using the website, and we also know how we can segment those users. So just doing those little iterations, starting to gather data, and then taking the time to personalize where it's actually going to bring value. Another question, can you suggest ways in which translation of bilingual websites could be better supported in Drupal? Yeah, so I think that there's just been such great work around all of the multilingual features in Drupal. Everything's managed now in a much more consistent way. I think the biggest areas for improvement are for all of the tools like Paragraph and Layout Builder and how that works, translating those elements. And in particular for a bilingual website, I know in Canada we have pretty much every government website has to be English and French. I'm seeing more and more US government websites in English and Spanish. So when we know that there's only 2 languages, having a side-by-side translation tool seems like much more user-friendly for content. But this introduces a lot of problems because Drupal is more than just editing fields side by side. Often there's things like the URL, the menu item, other kinds of metadata that also have to be translated. And so there is a side-by-side translation module, but I think if more people used it and refined it, we'd have better success with this. Yeah, we have tried to get subject matter experts to edit and create content directly, but they don't spend a lot of time on authoring. Yeah, so I think pinpointing maybe more specific content types that these types of users could work on, or having a way for them to create some of the content, but then have help or approval by a communications team. Like, those are things I've seen work, but it's true that a lot of content experts are still, authoring content in Word documents. And then it's another team that does the publishing. So thanks everyone for all your questions, especially Joseph. There's 2 Josephs. All the Josephs, thank you for all of your questions. And I really appreciate you all coming out here and your interest in this topic. So I will definitely share my slides, and I'll throw those into the chat, hopefully into the session description as well. Hopefully this gave you all some food for thought, and hope to see you all soon at another Drupal event.